like to take some questions?
I'd love to take some questions, and even questions about other things I might have been supposed to talk about. Wow. Yes.
Can I just ask you about a detail in your argument? You said along the way that if there is such a thing as a single end which we must, which we're born to serve,
yes,
well, it wouldn't really make sense for someone to say, oh yes, but I can be allowed to opt out of that.
Yeah.
What about someone who said something like, glorifying God is the end for all enlightened people? And everybody who sees that immediately realizes that's what it's all about. But that you can't glorify God by me making you glorify God. Sure. Or a similar argument, which is not a theistic one, by someone like Douglas Denial and Doug Rasmussen, whom you probably know, who say that there is they agree with sort of Aristotelian perfectionism, but they say that politically we need a non-perfectionist means to that, because even if it is a single thing that we almost go for, the moment that somebody forces someone else to embrace that, it evaporates.
Yeah. First of all, about the Denial and Rasmussen, there isn't, in I think the way you are suggesting, a single end. At the very most, they say there's a similar end, right, which is sort of well-being or flourishing for each person, and it's his or her well-being or flourishing. So there's not the sort of comprehensive unifying end that I was talking about. In the other example, I try to accommodate that by sticking in something about concession neutrality. There will be ways of trying to get. There'll be strategies that people will think of for getting people to promote this overarching radiant end that is believed in, which people will see. Well, there are some recalcitrant facts which those strategies are going to run up against. But the reason for permitting people not to join fully in the crusade is not that they have any deep liberty not to join, but the reason for permitting people not to join in the crusade is that there'll be too many side costs to driving them into it.
Isn't it because there's a distinction between what's morally important and what's politically permissible?
What I'm saying, we may be talking in a little bit of a circle there. We'll try to break out of it, okay? What I'm saying is that distinction doesn't really make sense if you adopt if you adopt belief in this comprehensive common end. Once you adopt that belief, the only reason for not conscripting people in a particular way into the service of that end are pragmatic reasons. It just won't work. These people have not yet been brought to the point that they can be good soldiers in the cause. And none of that amounts to recognizing that people have rights not to be brought into it. Yeah.
I'm interested in your first argument, which what one could probably classify as a negative argument at the beginning. You say, there's no higher end, thus there is permitted to live your life, and thus there must be a right somehow.
Yes, okay. I'm not sure negative argument, but go on.
Yeah, maybe just negative because at the beginning it starts with the negative thesis.
Yes. And you wouldn't say that in response to my second and final argument.
Probably not.
Okay. So let me just. Okay, that's good. I just want to make sure we're right triangulated right on that. Okay. So it goes to if we reject all versions of this higher comprehensive end, which people should serve, right? And we say instead it's permissible for people to live their own lives to their own ends. Okay? is there anything built into that blocks your suggested move? And I think the answer, I think the answer is yes. And the reasoning here is that when we say something like, and therefore it's permitted for everybody to live their own lives, we're understanding the permission that we're ascribing to each person as being compatible with other people having that same permission. And the way that's possible is that what I get to dispose of as I see fit is discrete from what you get to dispose of as you see fit. And so let me even give this as a historical. Hobbes, you might say, thought there isn't any ultimate end, right? Where we are masterless men, and that includes, there's no goal or end or telos, which is our master, right? So we're each free to live our own lives. He doesn't quite put it that way, right? But then he immediately says, so what that means in the state of nature is that I can do anything to anybody and they can do anything to me, right? And he talks about rights, but he says, you know, I have a right over you and you have a right over me. Okay? Locke said, and he calls it says this is the condition of I'm not sure whether Hobbes uses this phrase, but this is the fullest realization of freedom. Locke comes along, paragraph 57, I think, of his second treatise, and says, what sort of a freedom is it that makes me vulnerable to every ambition that other people have? Right? If we're going to say that people even have a permission to live their lives in their own chosen way, pursuing their own ends, right? For that to really grant anything, for it to supply people with what it purports to supply people with, it must be that there are limits on what other people can do in the pursuit of their ends, just as there are limits on what I can do in the pursuit of my ends. The language, I think, is telling. Locke would say, and I was using this sort of language, so each person is at liberty to live his own life or her own life in her way. Okay? So the liberty extends over you. The liberty extends over your life. Or you might have said each person is at liberty to dispose of himself and his possessions as he sees fit. Right? But the scope of the liberty, right, is limited. And it's limited in a way that it's the different scopes of liberty that people have are not mutually impinging. Right? So we say, well, the liberty that we're talking about, therefore, is the liberty to do with myself and maybe what I possess as I choose. Now, hasn't converted it to a right yet, right? Because then we say, well, of course, other people are not at liberty to do with me, right? But that doesn't show that it's wrong for them to aggress against me. To make it wrong for them, it must be that I must also have the right to live my life. But I think it's a good question. But I think the answer is that built into the move, well, we all must be free, or it must be permissible for each of us to live our lives in our own way, is a parsing out of what each person can dispose of in living their own life in their own way. And the basic parsing is each person gets to dispose of himself and his possessions. Yeah.
And you've taken the individual as your fundamental unit, and you have your sphere that centers around that.
Yeah.
And there's also an argument that you have the family as the fundamental unit.
Yeah.
because of the problem of kids, that in a sense their sphere is smaller, and you can impose a certain level of tyranny, if you will, on them until you're given age of 18 or whatever it is. So could you just comment on that and how you, what level do you...
So mostly I studiously avoid the questions that you're raising, right? And I think most libertarians do. They just think, well, what we're talking about is the individual, and of course kids eventually grow up, and then we take, then kids are just sort of special cases, right? If they don't quite have their full complement of rights, but they will eventually. Okay, so how can I distance myself from just that simple? I don't really. Now that I think of it, I really, in some way, don't understand or I find mysterious the claim that the family is the basic unit, right? I mean, what does that mean? That within the family, that there are moral principles that govern the interactions of families one with another, but not,
I don't believe that the family is the fundamental unit.
The
way I would look at it is that the kids are themselves individuals, and they have certain basic rights, like the rights to life, and you can't go kill them. But it's a recognition that their sphere has been reduced somewhat.
Yes.
And that's...
Yes.
So, for instance, where the parent wants to send them to school, it's not really up to the kids.
Right. So the only thing...
the way I see it, though, is just that if you can kind of codify it, and make it clear, then it's a much better system, as in you define what rights parents have. What they don't have. That would be my kind of ideal system.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think there's an interesting question about why parents have the rights that they have over their children, right? Which are much more extensive than the rights they have over other people. And I think that here is a little bit of sort of where the argument goes in the opposite direction from usual libertarian, and it's because they have certain obligations to the children, and they have to have certain authority in order to carry out those obligations. Why do they have those obligations? There, I think the story is something like when you put a person or proto-person in very dangerous situation, which children are, right? So they have to be protected in various ways and nourished in various ways. If you were to put somebody into that position, you would be bound to care for them until they emerge from that condition.
You make it dependent, then you have certain obligations.
Right. You lower somebody down a well with very slippery walls, and he goes, "Help, lift me up." And you go, "Sorry, my only rights are negative rights, right? Not to interfere." Well, that's in this story, you've already done something, right? So I think that's the story. I mean, there are crazy libertarians, like crazy everybody else, crazy libertarians, right, who thought that people own their children and stuff like that. That's, though it's a canard to say that somehow Locke thought that.
I'm just wondering, based on, you sort of touched on this in one of your responses to the questions here, but from your actual talk, I'm wondering what makes your position distinctively libertarian as opposed to, say, politically liberal, or even it could be compatible with forms of egalitarianism, because treating people as morally free and equal is a premise for all of these.
Sure. Okay. So there might have been some hints about this self-ownership stuff, right, which is a sort of flag.
Right, but it seemed that it was narrow enough to encompass all of
I think what I would say is, I think the emphasis on rights as restrictions or constraints, as opposed to ever allowing you to mandate goals for other people, is crucial. We were talking at dinner, and this paper that I mentioned that I'm going to give up in Manchester was a departure from the sort of fairly common libertarian view that the only natural right is this right of self-ownership. So I think there are other natural rights not to be rights that others who have entered contracts with you fulfill the contracts. I don't think that's self-ownership, but I think that's a right, and rights not to be prevented from acquiring property. But all of these rights are basically restrictive of other people's behavior. Doesn't tell other people how they have to behave, doesn't tell other people that they have to supply you with something. It just tells other people that as they go about their own business, they can't do it over your dead body, or over your dead pet, or, car.
Well, can I ask you how you make that leap? Like how you go from self-ownership to world ownership? Or ownership? Because I'm just curious, because that seems to me to be the crux of all libertarian arguments.
Okay. Well, maybe we should talk about that a little bit right afterwards.
Yeah, because I know it's a big topic.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, to sort of ground it in a more realistic political, actual event rather than theory.
Yes.
Say there was an overriding cause which, I don't know, say there was an agreement that climate change was man-made and that is a clear overriding thing if you ignore any dispute.
Yes. Wouldn't even have to be man-made for your purposes right now, right?
Perhaps, but that say my right is to, even though I know that, it's not affecting me right now, so I can do whatever I want, and that the people it's affecting, say, the generation that's not yet born.
Yes.
Do I have any responsibility to the next guys around? Do I have any right to sort of do it, even though it's absolutely clear that something's happening?
Yeah. Okay. So the climate change thing brings up somewhat different issues from the last part of the question, which is, do you have obligations to people who will come along, right? I mean, it's overlap, but I think so. Let me talk to the second part first. If I construct a time bomb that's not going to go off for 100 years, I'm doing something that will or is likely to kill a bunch of people when it goes off. I'm acting impermissibly. Or, there's a little problem, right? It will. Yeah, I think so. Right? Just as when I throw the hand grenade towards you, it hasn't yet gotten to you, right? I'm already acting impermissibly. And when I throw a hand grenade which just may blow up, right, over a certain small probability, I'm acting impermissibly. So I think I'm happy with what I first said. If I produce this time bomb, which is going to go off in 100 years, and very likely kill some people, I'm acting impermissibly. Who has the authority to stop me? That's an interesting question. This would be a good example for the argument that somebody can have the authority to stop me who isn't directly authorized by the likely victim, right? So I'm happy with that. So maybe now I see why it was important for you to say man-made. Aren't people now, by doing what they're doing, in effect creating this time bomb? If that were true, right, then it would be. It seems to me perfectly permissible to stop some of those people doing some of the things they're doing. Sure. Yeah. Let's go back here.
So this might relate to one of the speaker's earlier questions, but I was actually at the dinner table last night, and I was having this argument with this guy who calls himself a non-structuralist. Completely frustrated.
I think that's probably better than being a structuralist, though. I'm sure.
Basically, he had no beliefs. Like, all he had to do was just try and take apart the other beliefs.
Okay.
And it got back to this this key philosophical issue, which I have seen in textbooks, which I have unfortunately had to read for my philosophy classes, and it's the idea of original ownership. And it's not the idea that if we go back 10,000 years and I'm tilling the ground, that I don't have a right to the fruits of my labor. It's that I have a right to the ground, or that I have a right to the physical things in nature that existed before me.
Yes.
And I mean, obviously, once you set up a successor system, once you already have properly distributed, I mean, realistically, it's less of a problem.
Right. Right. So this goes to
they just throw that philosophical issue
yes,
at you.
yes.
And I was just wondering if there was a common response.
The right response is that there's no reason to affirm that right. That some sort of right to joint ownership or to equal share. What's the argument for such a right obtaining that you've ever heard?
Well, I've just heard. The problem is I've just heard an argument against the right of first ownership.
Okay.
And then this is how their brain works. I think.
Okay.
Their brain says, oh, so they don't have a right to first ownership, or they don't really have any rights. So I can do what I want, or I can just make fun.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look. I mean, so there are obviously 62 issues converging here, right? One argument against original individual ownership, right? That's what, is what you'd have to do to acquire to generate the ownership is itself impermissible because it's a violation of this shared right to the earth, right? Okay, so that argument requires that there be a positive case made for there being this right of joint ownership, original, right? Or the argument might be someone has occupied and made his own more than the fair share or an equal share. And that argument would require a separate argument for why there is such a claim to equal shares. Right? I think it's not just a rhetorical trick to say, surely the default position is there's just this stuff out there and people are at liberty to do things with it. And somebody wants to say, oh no, right? It's already sort of divided up in God's mind or something, right? Or we all are joint owners of it. There's a substantial burden of proof that falls on that person. Right? Second, there are all the arguments for why, if you affirm that right, you basically deny all sort of libertarian type rights of individual freedom and self-ownership, especially if you go with the joint. That there's an original joint right to the earth, because then the collectivity, the owner, can prevent anybody from doing anything unless that person agrees to the collectivity's demands. Okay? And so people who defend this position often think that somehow they can just tack on this equal ownership or joint ownership of the earth, and that produces a few pleasing egalitarian modifications, but leaves intact some robust notion of self-ownership. That's wrong.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your intergenerational justice argument.
Yeah.
And can I set an example? So say the next generation is born.
The next generation is poor?
Born. In existence.
Well, I'm sure they will be.
And we figured out we're carbon neutral. We're not producing any more pollution. But
okay. Go on. Although I suspect that
this is the future.
Wait. Is this all in scare quotes on your part?
What?
Oh, I mean, are you just asking us to go along with a bunch of ideas which you don't particularly accept yourself, or
No, I'm just setting up an example.
Okay, good. We're carbon neutral, and that means what? We don't increase the amount of
any pollution. I'm not a scientist.
any pollution.
No pollution.
So we're neutral with respect to every type of material that somebody might have any.
We're doing really well.
Yeah. But when you say well, right, you mean that as kind of a joke.
We deserve a star, I think.
What?
It's a thought experiment.
Okay. No, okay. So we're doing really well. I know. And how would? One question before you go on. How does it come about that we're doing so well?
Well, if I knew that, then I would be a scientist. this, and I'll be able to successfully.
Okay.
I'd be in the wrong room.
Okay. Okay. We're doing. People just spontaneously do things, and it produces this.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
We can offset it. We offset all the carbon residues.
There is the technology to replete the ozone layer. Do we have a responsibility to the following generation to implement those sort of technologies, even though we're not the people that cause them?
Okay. Good. So I think this follows up on my answer over here. Suppose it were true, but I'm not sure why you had it set it up with no pollution now. Right?
Because we're not culpable, it's our predecessors who are culpable, but we have the power, at some sacrifice to ourselves, to fix a problem that we inherited.
Oh, fix the problem. I see. No. Then people wouldn't be obligated to fix.
Even if it means that the Earth would be finished in the following generation.
I'm sorry. I thought we had achieved this. There were no more pollution. There was no more pollution, but there was still more pollution than we would like. I thought that was your case.
Okay, what she's saying, if I may, is that the delayed effects of behaviour before us means that even if we contribute nothing either positively or negatively, we're on a time scale that the Earth is going to lapse in a generation. Do we have to do something ourselves that's a positive thing towards the Earth and a negative cost to ourselves? To fix something that's running out because of the behaviour of others before us?
Good. I would say we're not obligated. It might be a nice thing to do. The case of the difference between moral and political. I don't mean that facetiously. The only way I could see an argument being made for being obligated is which would run through premises about how we were gainers from the past pollution, right? And so somehow we incur some sort of obligation for the effects of that past pollution, right? Maybe, but if the bare fact is people in the past did something, that's going to eventuate in harm for people in the future. What we're doing is not going to produce that harm, but what those people in the past did. Then my own view would be, and I think the view of the sort of position that I've been talking about, that there's no obligation to make the future better than it otherwise would be, right? The crucial issue is whether your agency is involved in the harm that is going to befall others. If your agency is involved, then you can be required to change your behavior. But I myself don't think that merely not doing something constitutes your agency being involved. And so is that the refutation of the position as far as you're concerned?
I understand your point.
Okay. So why should good, fine. Yes.
So I was wondering about the definition of freedom that you're working with. Because
but I thought you said the word freedom.
But the claim you made about joint ownership is parasitic on a claim about freedom. Because
I said that people who talk about joint ownership think that they can assert it and still have the and still enjoy the proceeds of self-ownership.
Right, but so where I think you've got yourself in a bit of a difficulty with the definition of freedom, though, is that it sounds as though what you're saying...
I never gave you a definition of
freedom.
It's
implicit in what you're saying. Where you got yourself in trouble, right, is on the account you're offering, it looks as though, say, if you grab that chair before I get to it, you haven't made me not free to get that chair, but it looks as though you have. So it strikes me that you somehow need to motivate this claim that, somehow that acquiring things is not unfreedom, but preventing you from acquiring things in this way is unfreedom. you see what I mean?
I do see.
Yeah.
So the short answer is that if I were to define freedom, I would define it in terms of rights. And I would say, at least as a first approximation, that to be free is to not be subject to violations of your rights. So the work has to be done in terms of the specification of rights. If somebody has produced that chair and left it there for me to sit in first, I had no right to sit in it first. I had no right before I got there to be the person in that chair, and neither did you. So if I get there before you, your freedom isn't diminished. And if you get there before me, my freedom isn't diminished.
But is this a claim about rights, or is this a claim about legitimate process? Now it sounds like you're offering a claim about which processes are legitimate and which aren't. It doesn't seem like it flows from the account of rights you're offering.
I'm not sure what process came in here.
Well, so it sounds as though you're offering an argument, right, that there are certain ways of acquiring things. So that this chair just sitting there is okay for you to grab it.
I am saying that, but I don't think that was part of the logic of my last couple of sentences. The logic of my last couple of sentences was that if you're going to define freedom, you actually have to first give a specification of what people's rights are, and then a felicitous understanding of freedom. It won't fit every possible use of the word freedom. A felicitous understanding of freedom is the condition of not having your rights violated. So, to go back to a little conversation we had, it's when the slave owner continues to exercise control over the slave, the slave's freedom is violated. The slave is unfree because the slave's rights are violated. When the slave escapes, making it the slave owner unable to continue to make use of the slave. Why sit there, making you unable to sit in the chair? That's not an infringement on the slaveholder's freedom.
Okay, but it still sounds as though you need some account.
No, I said you give a specification of rights and you understand freedom. Given that understanding of rights, of course, then you have to have an account of what rights people have and how they get those rights.
But sure. So now it sounds like what you're saying is that there's some account of rights which you think invalidates joint ownership, but you haven't quite told us what that is.
Oh, no. Okay, first of all, I said that there's never been a positive argument for joint ownership. That the burden of proof is on people who assert joint ownership, and there's no argument. There is literally no argument. I mean, very, very, very smart people assert joint ownership. Never is there an argument. Second, almost everybody who talks about joint ownership wants to introduce it as a supplement to self-ownership. And there's never sufficient attention paid to whether or not those two things can coexist. People who invoke joint ownership, original joint ownership of the earth, think that they're not giving up much in the way of their subscription to self-ownership, but it's much, much more costly on the self-ownership side than is generally recognized. So that's an argument, an internal argument against that type of advocacy of joint ownership. On top of good old Locke had the ultimate argument against joint ownership. Joint ownership means if there's joint original ownership of the earth, the people who don't care or getting, if we are all joint owners of the earth to begin with, then each of us would need the permission of everybody else before we could do anything in the pursuit of our survival, but we wouldn't be able to get that because first I'd have to get a megaphone to yell to everybody, but then I don't have a right to get the megaphone. And therefore, if there's original joint ownership and people are rights respecting, everybody just has to sit still until they die.
Well,
That's a pretty good argument.
I actually think there are positive arguments for joint ownership that are quite powerful, actually, but we leave that for later.
Can you suggest one biography now?
Well, yes, so I think the positive argument runs something like this, that all else being equal, when there are things out there in the world, we all have an equal claim to them. Therefore, if you want to take it, you have to leave it not enough and as good for me.
I think, well, first of all, look, two things.
Yeah.
We all have an equal claim, right?
Yeah.
That's perfectly consistent with, this is the equality of our claims, namely none of us have any claim, right? From we all have an equal claim, joint ownership or anything, or equal ownership doesn't follow. Okay? So that's first.
No,
yes, I mean, come on, right?
But if there's no ownership, then you don't have the obligation to leave enough and it's good.
So another problem with the folks that you people have been reading, many of whom are or were friends of mine, and who I have admiration for. I lost my train of thought.
Well, it's plausible that you may have to reject self-ownership under some of the accounts that we're given.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. After I got off track by talking about my admiration for people.
Well, can I ask you, because you've made this claim, which is basically that the burden of proof rests with the people who think there should be, all other things being equal, there should be some kind of claim to joint ownership.
Yeah.
So Nozick, for example, comes up with a Lockean proviso, and he says these are the conditions for legitimately taking something as private.
Good. I'm a friend of Lockean provisos.
Right.
I endorse Lockean provisos. The problem, so thank you. I'll let you come back, but let me just, okay. The problem with some of the folks that you guys are thinking of is that they don't distinguish between the endorsement of a proviso and the acceptance of some sort of egalitarian rule of distribution. They're two completely different things. It's one thing to say, I can't so acquire that basically other people are imprisoned with 1 foot, right? And they can't go anywhere, and they can't do anything, and they're worse off with respect to their interaction with the world than they would be if there never had been acquisition. That's one thing, right? And if you say that, and I say that, you have to hold that if it were true about private acquisition, that it straightens people in that way, right? Then those people would have a just complaint. But that's completely separate from the idea that there's some egalitarian rule about how stuff or natural stuff ought to be distributed. And this is my good friend Hillel Steiner, who has just continually, he's going to see him in a couple of days, he really is my friend, but he just totally equates the idea of accepting a proviso and accepting that there ought to be some original equal distribution. He so equates it that sometimes he actually misquotes Locke, and where Locke says enough and as good is to be left. Hillel quotes Locke as saying enough and as much has to be left. Right? Okay. Now I'm sorry. I got so excited by remembering what I had forgotten.
Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. No, so the issue to me is, the problem that I have is, you've made this claim about rights. I think there's a position for rights in any kind of moral philosophy. But libertarians have this fundamentalism about rights. They're not pluralists in any conceivable sense. And the argument for a more equal or a less unequal or just a wholly equal distribution goes as follows. The factors which allow you to appropriate property are likely to be arbitrary. So I come into the world in the 21st century, all property and land has already been appropriated. There's nothing left for me to claim, and the only reason that you were able to appropriate it was because, you built a fence around this patch and you happen to be the first person to get there.
Right.
Now that land in itself,
Right.
having access to those resources, produces enormous benefits, consequential benefits throughout the course of your life. Those benefits are what allow you to pursue your conception of the good life on your account of why you need these rights. It's because you're saying there's a separateness of persons, and what it's rational for each of us to do is to pursue our conception of the good life. Now it seems this fundamentalism about rights, regardless of any of the other consequences, is for an awful lot of people going to end up undermining their ability to substantively pursue their conception of the good rights, which is the whole justification for your absolute claim about rights in the first place.
Good. It's not an accident that the prospects for individual well-being are, I won't say best, but look pretty good in a regime in which libertarian rights are respected. And the reason for that is all the sort of standard social theory, economic theory stories about incentives and fragmentation of knowledge and people being able to, decentralization of decision-making. Again, I said something about incentives and notions of responsibility. So if somehow the world were somehow so different in its nature, or people were so different in their nature, that staking out these rights naturally boded ill for lots of people, I would be uneasy about the rights, okay? I don't think that's true.
Okay.
And I don't think, and this is really important, this is a less abstract point, but I think really, I don't think that that other people getting places first and making some stuff, lots of stuff, their property, is disadvantageous to latecomers.
Well, but in that
I think the people who get there first usually die of cholera or starve to death, and the next people discover that the field is half cleared. I mean, I'm making a joke of it, but I think that I really appeal to you to think that that's a serious point.
So I agree, but what you're saying is right. You're now going back to relying on a kind of consequentialist logic. So let me put a counterpoint. Just take Rawls, right? Rawls isn't a libertarian, he's a liberal. But he has an important place for rights in his theory. The distinction from where... Well, he does. I mean, a lot of the rights that you consider absolute basic rights are his first principle of justice. And egalitarian
but that's not a distinctive feature of his theory. But go on.
No, it's not. But they hold a distinctive position within the theory, is what I'm saying, right? There are parts of this that a libertarian can get on board with. And then he comes along and says, but when you go towards... he has the same concerns about efficiency that you do, which is why there's a difference principle that allows for certain kinds of inequalities, right? Even though on his own moral terms, he doesn't think inequalities are justifiable because all the things that separate human beings are arbitrary from a moral point of view. And he has... Sorry. So he built all of this in, but what he says is, my key element here is about separateness of persons and your ability to pursue your conception of the good life. And to do this, you're going to need some substantive, what he calls primary goods, to do it. So you're going to have to distribute them in a much fairer, more equal way than would happen under a libertarian theory. Now, it seems to me the only argument, and Rawls uses this phrase himself, the only response you can give is intuitively, does that seem more plausible than, say, the libertarian argument? This just comes back to the second claim, which is, so what I'm also interested in is, what's your epistemic basis for the claims that you make? Are these just intuitionist claims? Are they empirical claims? I mean, because you use this in the notion of natural rights.
Which claims?
Well, all of the libertarians, that we should base our entire moral philosophy on this notion of rights, which rights, as far as I'm concerned, they don't exist. They're just things that we make up to embody certain values that we hold. So you have to ask yourself, where do you get those values from? It's just things that you find intuitively plausible.
So the answer to that is, I thought in that presentation, although this was a very quick and sloppy presentation, but the idea was to trace the case for rights to some more fundamental claims about the rationality of each person's pursuit of their good. And I didn't offer an argument for that, and I'm not sure how one would argue for that. It's about as basic as you can get, and a feature of the argument, my argument, was that, and maybe I couldn't have gotten this hook into a non-utilitarian, into a glorified God person, right? But the characteristic utilitarian argument says, well, yeah, it sure looks as though that's what's rational, promoting one's own good. Now let me figure out some way that I can show that what's really rational is promoting the general good. I think all those attempts to move from the rationality of individual utility maximization to the rationality of aggregate utility maximization fail. Okay? And so we're back where we should be, I think, in terms of the rationality of goal-directed action is promoting the good of the agent. And then the question is whether or not there's another component of morality, which is not a component of, not a matter of what should people go for, but are there constraints? And that's what I try to do, to say, one thing you get out of rationality of people promoting their own good is this liberty. People aren't obliged to accept, but the liberty doesn't come to anything unless it's clothed in the right. So that's one argument. And the other is the more Kantian type argument, saying if we think of people as beings with ends of their own, right, not obliged to give up their own ends for the sake of these purportedly higher ends, what sort of significance should that have for us, the viewers of those? And I argue that the plausible significance, reading of the significance, is we are bound to be constrained in our behavior, but we don't have to adopt their ends as our ends. So those may not be totally compelling arguments, but they're arguments.
No, I think it's just, I don't think you could have plausibly said more than you just said. I think that's the best justification you can give. I just think it's inherently an intuitionist one, which leads you to the problem of when someone comes along and says, I've got different intuition.
Okay, well, I mean, so the starting point, in some sense, right, the rationality, practical rationality, insofar as it concerns goals, is a matter of the agent identifying and attaining his good. Okay? I don't know whether you want to call that an intuition or something else. If it's an intuition that vast amounts of social science depends upon. I don't know what the alternative to it is at that level, which would have its plausibility. And as far as the rest of the argument goes, it's not at least a blanket appeal to intuition. I, for instance, raised the question, well, what sort of import, if any, for my behavior should I take the fact of your existence as a being with ends of your own to have? And there are different possible understandings of what the import is, right? And I tried to say that just the denial that there's any import is implausible. Is that an intuition? Well, it's an intuition, but it's also when we're building a theory, you think about, well, what sort of parts can go together and how would it go? And if you don't take a certain step, then do you end up with nothing? right? And so it's all of that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to go in there and go into the second argument. You gave us the three possibilities.
Yeah.
Good. If you accept this, that, I mean, if it has no input at all, that would be somehow like a psychopath.
Yeah, that's my little
let's put them on. But we still could say, sure, it has an input. We could, for example, it has the input that we now have a different possibility to influence this.
Yes.
We give them arguments.
Yes.
Not just with force. But that doesn't lead us at all to.
That's right.
To
That's right.
rights.
That's right. That's right. So that's a very nice example of a question. When I try to argue this out more extensively, I try to talk about the difference between this fact about other people having an effect on my strategies for dealing with them, right? And so, for instance, if they're thinking beings, I may say, oh, here's another way of controlling them. I could trick them. I could lie to them, right? And the argument I want to make is that it's got to have an import that goes beyond the strategic, right? And I'm not sure if I can at the moment produce the arguments for why I say that, but complicated. One of the things, there are all different sorts of possibilities for interaction with beings that are rational, that you can speak to. You understand that they have certain sorts of motives. That's going to make a difference both in terms of what you can pull off in dealing with them and what you can't pull off. Why I said you have to be careful when you're trying to, right? And so the argument I have to make is that there's an import above and beyond those sorts of imports. And the way I try to do that actually is to imagine robots that are programmed to act and react the way human beings are, but really have no consciousness and so on. And the difference between, but are mistaken for regular human beings by other people. And so the other people sort of manipulate and do things to them very carefully because they know these are touchy creatures, or at least they behave. And then they discover, they do this because they think these beings are robots. But they're very careful because they're programmed to react like human beings. But they figure out ways to do things to them which would be nasty if the robots were really people. And then they discover they really are. And they go, oops. Right? That oops is not because they made a strategic mistake, but there was something about the way they should have been constrained, which they didn't think applied because they thought they were just robots. So that's that's kind of intuition pumping too, but that's what you got to do sometimes.
Maybe just one more question.
Oh, okay.
Probably call them up.
You said you can use the force or threat of force to stop people and violating rights.
Yeah.
But to what extent? Are there any limits on the amount of force you can use?
Good.
If I say the only way to prevent someone from scratching you on the arm is to kill them, is that allowed? And also, what about with probabilities? If someone's about to press a button that will kill you with 99% probability, are you allowed to kill them? Or if it's 80% or 50% or
Yes. Yes. Good. That's another really good question. Usually people say that when they're not going to answer it. We try to answer. So the probability is also a nice part at the end. I was about to say that if you're certain you have to do something very drastic, even to protect yourself against a minor violation of rights, you can do it. But you shouldn't be certain that you're certain. If somebody says, I'm going to scratch your arm, and you go, if you do, I won't like you. They go, I'm going to do it anyway. You say, if you do, I'm going to kill your cat. And they go, I'm going to do it anyway, right? You go, well, I say, well, not only will I kill your cat, I'll burn your house down. They go, I'm still going to do it anyway, right? And in fact, there's nothing I can do, there's nothing I can say, right? And I know I'm going to say, well, I'm going to strike you with this hammer, right? And wound you. And they go, I have a very thick skull. Unless you actually kill me, you won't stop me from that. I mean, this is a very imaginary sort of situation. But if you were in that situation, so you really knew, right, that you had to escalate your defense in order to protect yourself, then I think it's justified, right? If you really knew, right? The problem is that any element of doubt, right, you got to take extremely serious, because if you are wrong, right, you're really wrong, right? I mean, if you've killed somebody when you could have stopped them by slapping their hand, right? That's a big no-no. So probably, even when in some sense you're certain that you have to do something very drastic to protect yourself from a small harm, it might be wise not to. And the probabilities, I think, we could work in but that the probabilities raise even bigger-ish problems where it's not very high probabilities or very low probabilities, but kind of middle probabilities. That's a really tough thing for rights people to talk about.
I think we should probably stop it there. So if I can join